He went into the mountains for a routine hunting trip with his dog, but when he stumbled upon a crashed helicopter and opened the door, he realized there was no turning back. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The wind rolled softly through the pines of western Montana, whispering through the needles like distant surf. The mountains rose in solemn lines against the pale morning sky, streaked with cold sunlight and ribbons of lingering mist. The world here was wide, quiet, and slow, and that was exactly what Dan Crawford needed. He had come to these woods years ago to bury what remained of his past, to outlast the noise of people and engines and sirens. Solitude had become not just his choice, but his defense. A quiet shell around a man who no longer trusted much beyond what his eyes could see and his hands could mend. Dan was a large man, weathered and strong, though his strength was no longer loud. His frame carried the lean tension of someone used to labor and survival. His hair, once black, had faded to the color of wet ash, and his face bore the kind of calm that often follows too many fires, literal and otherwise. He had been a smoke jumper, a firefighter who dropped from planes into infernos. The job had carved deep lines into his face long before age began to do the same. 10 years had passed since the blaze that ended his career and his old life. He still saw it when he closed his eyes. The collapsing canopy of flame, the choking heat, his partner's voice swallowed by the roar. After that, the city became unbearable. The sympathy, the questions, the paperwork, it was all noise. So he sold what he had, bought a piece of land up near the Bitterroot Range, and stopped talking to nearly everyone. He built his cabin by hand, a small square of rough timber on a ridge above a stream. His days followed an unspoken rhythm: chop wood, fix tools, cook what you catch, listen to the wind. And through all of it, there was Bear. The dog had arrived as a muddy, half-starved pup after the fire, found wandering near a burned trailhead. Now, years later, Bear was huge, a black Labrador with eyes as intelligent as a man's, and a coat that shone like coal dust when the sun hit it. They had the easy companionship of two survivors. Words weren't needed. Bear seemed to know when to stay close and when to roam, when to rest his head against Dan's knee, and when to vanish into the trees for hours, chasing scents that only he could understand. On a mid-October morning, frost still glittered on the grass around the cabin. Dan was preparing for a long hunt, his first deep one of the season. He moved methodically, checking gear the way a soldier checks weapons, cleaning his rifle, sorting ammunition, coiling rope, packing dry meat, matches, and a small coffee pot. Every motion was deliberate, practiced. He wrote a short note on a torn envelope and left it pinned above his desk. North Ridge, back Sunday. It wasn't for anyone in particular. No one ever came up here. But he did it anyway, a habit from a world that still expected men to come back from the woods. When the sun rose fully, he slung his rifle across his back and whistled. Bear appeared from the tree line, tail low, nose glistening with dew. Together they headed into the forest. The trail behind the cabin twisted downward, crossed a stream, and disappeared into an expanse of old-growth timber. The world changed there. The air cooled, the light dimmed. The smell of pine and damp earth replaced the thin smoke from his stove. For Dan, each step deeper into the wilderness peeled away another layer of weight. Out here, there were no memories of fire, no voices, no guilt. Only silence, the soft rhythm of footsteps, and the faint click of Bear's claws on the stones. They walked for miles that day. The terrain grew rougher, full of ridges and gullies where fog lingered like trapped breath. Dan studied tracks on the ground: deer, elk, maybe a black bear farther upslope, but didn't shoot. The hunt was never about killing. It was about stillness, about matching the patience of the forest. He paused often, letting Bear move ahead, scanning the brush for motion, feeling the world settle around him. By afternoon, he found a clearing with a stream running through it and decided to make camp there. He built a small fire and boiled coffee while the dog rested nearby. The day dimmed quickly, the sky fading from pale blue to iron gray. Smoke curled lazily between the trees. Dan sat by the flames and watched the woods darken, that soft hour before night when colors melt away and everything seems to hold its breath. Bear dozed with his head on his paws, his chest rising and falling steadily. The sound of the creek became the only voice in the world. When darkness finally came, it came completely. The fire burned down to glowing coals. Dan lay in his sleeping bag inside the small nylon tent, half listening to the forest. He was used to the night noises, the crack of settling branches, the cry of an owl. But tonight something felt different. Bear's breathing changed first, a low, steady rumble deep in his chest. Dan opened his eyes and saw the dog sitting upright, staring at the tent's entrance. The hair along his spine was raised. Dan whispered a quiet word, but Bear didn't move. The sound that reached him next was subtle, almost imagined, the crunch of something heavy stepping on frost. Once, twice, then silence again. He lay still, waiting, every sense sharpened. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then, somewhere up the slope, a faint metallic echo drifted through the trees. It wasn't a gunshot, more like a hollow strike of steel against stone. It came once and then faded. Bear's growl deepened, but stopped when Dan placed a calm hand on his neck. He listened for a long time, but the noise didn't return. Eventually, he forced himself to relax, convincing his mind it was just a fallen branch or distant rock slide. Yet the thought stayed with him, even after he drifted into uneasy sleep. Metal, out there where no machine had been in years. At dawn, the world was washed in silver mist. The air was so cold that his breath hung like smoke. Dan stirred the last of the embers back to life, poured coffee into a tin cup, and watched the day wake up. Bear paced near the trees, restless, ears flicking. When Dan shouldered his pack, the dog moved ahead instantly, sniffing the trail with nervous focus. It wasn't his usual easy trot. Something had caught his attention. They followed a narrow ridge that led into thicker timber. The ground rose steeply, and the trees grew denser, shutting out the light. Birdsong was rare here. Even the wind seemed to move around this place instead of through it. After an hour of climbing, Bear suddenly froze. His nose pressed toward the ground, then toward the air. His tail went stiff, his muscles quivering. Dan stopped, scanning the forest. The silence was absolute. Then Bear broke into motion. He bolted downslope, barking once, a sharp, echoing sound that vanished into the fog. "Bear!" Dan called, but the word died in the air. He slung his rifle forward and started after him, sliding down the damp incline, his boots tearing at roots and wet leaves. The dog's barks grew more urgent, then stopped altogether. The slope leveled out into a hollow where fog clung thick as smoke. For a moment, Dan saw nothing but trees and moss-covered stones. Then, through the haze, something loomed ahead. At first, it looked like the curve of a cliff, but the shape was wrong, smooth, rounded, unnatural. He stepped closer, his heartbeat quickening. The fog parted, and he saw it clearly. A massive shape of metal lay half buried in the earth. The color was muted olive, streaked with rust, the surface covered in vines and moss. The curve of a rotor blade jutted from the ground at an angle, like a broken arm reaching upward. The smell of oil and wet iron clung faintly in the air. Bear stood beside it, silent now, ears flat, as if sensing that whatever this was did not belong to the forest. Dan approached slowly, one cautious step at a time. When his hand brushed the cold surface, he felt the rough scars of impact under his fingers. The realization came slowly, almost reluctantly. It was a helicopter, or what remained of one. For a long moment he just stared, the quiet pressing against him from all sides. A forgotten wreck deep in the Montana wilderness, far from any trail or flight path. It looked ancient, but something about it felt wrong. Wrong in a way he couldn't yet name. The fog thickened again, wrapping the wreck like a shroud. Bear whined softly. Dan looked once more at the torn metal and the fading letters barely visible through the grime. He couldn't read the whole marking, just enough to know it was military. USAR. The rest was gone, swallowed by rust. He stepped back, heart pounding with a strange mix of awe and unease. The woods around him were still, watching. The morning felt heavier now, as if the forest itself knew he had uncovered something that should have stayed buried. Behind him, Bear gave a single low bark and turned toward the ridge, ears cocked to the distance. Dan followed the dog's gaze but saw nothing except the rolling mist and the motionless trees. Then, just on the edge of hearing, he thought he caught a faint sound again, the same hollow metallic ring he had heard the night before, echoing somewhere far up the mountain. He stood there motionless, hand on the cold frame of the buried machine, listening. The noise faded, leaving only silence. But in that silence, something inside him shifted, a deep, undeniable awareness that his solitude had just been broken. Whatever this thing was, whatever had fallen and been forgotten, it was not finished with him yet, and neither, he suspected, were the people who once owned it. The fog did not lift for hours. It hung between the trees like pale smoke, wrapping the forest in a muffled hush that swallowed every sound. Dan stood beside the wreck for a long time before he could bring himself to move. The sight of it unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite explain. He had seen burned machines before, trucks and planes twisted by fire. Yet this felt different. There was something deliberate about how it rested here, almost hidden, half devoured by time and moss. The forest had been trying to reclaim it, but not enough to erase its presence. It was a scar that refused to heal. Bear circled the wreck, sniffing cautiously. His tail was down, body low to the ground. Dan crouched beside the twisted metal, running a hand along the cold surface. The paint peeled away in flakes, revealing gray beneath the olive green. He brushed aside a mat of damp moss and found faint stenciled letters. U.S. Army. The marking sent a small jolt through him. What was an Army helicopter doing this deep in the Montana backcountry? The nearest military base was hundreds of miles away. He stepped around the fuselage, studying the shape of it, the curved canopy, the heavy frame, the mangled rotor blades that had snapped like brittle twigs on impact. The nose was buried in the dirt, the tail section bent upward at a grotesque angle. Whatever brought it down had been violent, yet there were no burn marks, no signs of explosion, no crater. It looked as though the aircraft had simply fallen from the sky and landed here to sleep. Bear whined softly, nose pressed against the open door to the cockpit. Dan leaned closer, shining his flashlight into the darkness inside. The beam cut through the dust and shadows, illuminating broken dials, twisted wiring, and the remains of two seats, one empty, the other still strapped with frayed belts. He swallowed hard. There were no bodies. Maybe the crew had been rescued long ago, though that made little sense. A crash this remote should have been impossible to hide. He climbed carefully inside. The air smelled faintly of oil and old leather. Shards of shattered plexiglass glittered on the floor. He saw clawed scrapes along the inner panels, strange marks as if someone had pried things open in a hurry. The instrument panel had been ripped apart. Whoever came here after the crash had been looking for something. He reached down, brushing away leaves and grime, until his hand struck something solid beneath the co-pilot's seat. It was a box metal, heavy, and sealed with a rusted latch. He dragged it free, coughing as a cloud of dust rose. Stamped into the side were the faint words, "Property of U.S. Goft." There was no serial number, no unit markings. A chill ran through him. He knew military equipment when he saw it, but this was something else, something that didn't belong to any standard manifest. He tried to open the latch, but it was fused shut, sealed tight as if welded by time. He turned and climbed back out of the wreckage, hauling the container with him. The fog pressed close, dimming the daylight into a kind of endless twilight. He set the box down on a patch of moss and studied it. The edges were smooth, unmarked by weather, and the lock looked surprisingly new. Someone had touched this not long ago. He scanned the ground and noticed impressions in the damp soil, a faint outline of boot prints leading away from the helicopter, half filled by rain. The edges were still crisp. They hadn't been here more than a few days. A pulse of unease traveled through him. He was deep in an area that no hiker, no hunter, no tourist ever entered. For someone to reach this far meant purpose. The idea that he wasn't the first person to find this place gnawed at him. He ran a slow breath through his teeth, trying to quiet his thoughts, then lifted the box onto his shoulder. Bear trotted beside him, glancing back toward the wreck as they began the steep climb out of the hollow. The mist clung to them all the way up. When they finally reached the ridge, the light had begun to fade, turning the forest a muted gray-green. Dan found his camp undisturbed and dropped the box beside the fire pit. He gathered wood and built a small blaze, the smoke curling into the damp air. For a long time he sat staring at the flames, his mind circling the same question. How could a military helicopter crash in a place like this and be forgotten? He poured coffee into a dented tin cup, its heat seeping into his hands. Bear lay close, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. Every so often his ears twitched, but he didn't growl. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual rustle of small animals and the occasional hoot of an owl were missing. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Dan's thoughts turned to the box. He wanted to open it, but part of him hesitated. Years of dealing with accidents and the aftermath of disasters had taught him that curiosity could be dangerous. He leaned forward, studying the lock in the flickering light. It was standard, but the steel was newer than the box itself. Someone had replaced it, recently. He told himself he would leave it until morning. He'd haul it back to town, maybe call the sheriff, let them deal with it. But he already knew he wouldn't. The military would show up, they'd take it, and he'd never know what he had found. And that thought, irrational as it was, bothered him. Because something deep inside him whispered that whatever had fallen in that ravine wasn't supposed to exist. The night grew colder. He pulled his jacket tighter and fed another log into the fire. The flames hissed and cracked, throwing brief flashes of orange light onto the trees. Bear shifted suddenly, lifting his head, eyes glinting. Dan froze, following the dog's gaze toward the darkness beyond the creek. He saw nothing at first, only the dim pattern of trunks and shadows. Then far through the mist, a pinpoint of light appeared, small, steady, moving slowly between the trees. He tensed. It wasn't a star. It was too low. It flickered again, vanished, then came back. Someone was walking out there with a flashlight. Dan reached for his rifle, heart pounding. No one should be here. No one even knew where here was. He crouched, watching the light weave between the trees, trying to judge the distance. It moved deliberately, not like a lost hiker. It was searching. After a few minutes, it disappeared behind the slope, swallowed by the fog. Bear gave a low whine, tail stiff, but Dan hushed him softly. They waited in silence. The minutes dragged. Then faintly the sound reached them, the distant thump of rotors. Not the slow chop of an old machine, but the smooth mechanical rhythm of something modern, something flying low. The noise pulsed through the trees, growing louder for a moment before fading toward the west. He listened until it was gone, his jaw set tight. The woods remained still afterward, but the feeling of safety had evaporated. Dan sat with his back to a tree, eyes fixed on the direction the light had come from. The fire burned lower and lower until only the red glow of coals remained. Bear stayed awake beside him, muscles tense, every breath slow and controlled. He told himself it could have been Forestry Service officers or surveyors or maybe even campers strayed too far, but none of those explanations made sense. The fog, the wreck, the sealed box, it all felt connected somehow. He looked at the heavy metal container resting near the firelight and thought of the fresh boot prints near the helicopter. Someone else had been looking for it, maybe still was. As the cold crept in and the last ember dimmed, Dan realized there would be no sleep that night. The forest felt alive again, but not with animals, alive with watchful intent. Somewhere beyond the trees, a branch snapped, deliberate and sharp. Bear's head turned instantly. Dan gripped his rifle, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved. The sound didn't come again, but by then, the thought had already rooted deep inside him. The helicopter wasn't the only thing buried out there. Someone or something had come back for what it carried. And now that he had taken the box, they would come for him. The gray light of dawn crept reluctantly through the pines, revealing a camp that looked as if it had been frozen in time. Dan sat motionless beside the dying fire, the rifle resting across his knees, his face drawn and sleepless. The dog dozed lightly, ears twitching at every distant crack of wood or flutter of wings. The forest seemed to have reclaimed its natural rhythm, but Dan's nerves had not. The memory of that faint light moving through the trees still clung to him. Whoever had been out there had known where to look. He could feel it in his gut. The metal box sat near the cold ashes, streaked with condensation. He had stared at it for hours, as if by sheer will he could force it to explain itself. The fog had lifted, and the forest looked ordinary again. Yet the presence of that box changed everything. It was a foreign object in a world that had no use for secrets. Dan poured the last of the coffee from the pot, its bitter taste grounding him in something real. The decision formed itself quietly in his mind. He had to see what was inside. Bear watched as he retrieved his pry bar from his pack and knelt beside the container. The lock was rusted at the edges, but not old. It took several minutes of leverage and cursing under his breath before it finally gave way with a metallic snap. The sound echoed faintly, unnatural in the morning stillness. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then lifted the lid. Inside lay an orderly arrangement of sealed plastic envelopes, all in near-perfect condition. Beneath them, wrapped in a dark cloth, was a smaller black case, sleek and modern, its surface embossed with the letters DOE Contractor Division. Department of Energy. The name meant little to him, but the neatness of the contents struck him like a blow. This was no wreck from decades ago. These documents hadn't spent long in the elements. Someone had placed them here, not years but months before. He pulled one envelope free and held it to the light. Inside was a series of printed photographs. His breath caught as he saw what they showed. A helicopter identical to the one in the ravine photographed from multiple angles. Tail numbers visible, serial plates intact. The date stamped in the corner read June 2022. Dan stared at it, his heart thudding. He looked back toward the trees as though expecting the forest itself to react. He opened another folder. This one contained typed pages, routing logs and coordinates. He recognized a few of the names printed across the top of the formed cities, small military airfields, and something that made his throat tighten. A restricted zone along the Idaho border, known for energy research projects. The routes didn't make sense. They crisscrossed the country like threads in a web, with deliveries labeled as non-lethal technical material and energy conversion samples. None of it sounded like the business of the Department of Energy. He had fought wildfires near those areas. There had been rumors of shipments and closed roads, but no one paid attention to rumors in the backcountry. Bear let out a low whine, drawing Dan's attention. The dog stood facing the forest again, nose raised, tail rigid. Dan listened, but there was nothing, only the faint rush of wind through the trees. Still he felt it, the same prickling awareness that had haunted him all night. He gathered the documents quickly and placed them back into the container, keeping only the black case. He examined it closely. It was sealed with a biometric lock, the kind used in high-security research labs. On its side was a port for digital access. He couldn't open it, not here. He'd need power and a computer. His laptop at home was old but still worked. It might be enough to read what was on it. He packed everything away, doused the remnants of the fire, and scanned the ground for signs that anyone might have followed him. The prints he found were his own and Bear's, but that meant little in a place where rain and pine needles could erase a man's trail overnight. The hike back felt longer. The forest had turned watchful again. Each gust of wind seemed to shift the branches like breathing. Bear ranged ahead but never far, his movements taut with unease. Twice he stopped suddenly, nose to the wind, body trembling, before moving on. The silence was oppressive. By the time the roof of his cabin came into view through the trees, Dan's shoulders ached from tension as much as weight. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine pitch and stale coffee. He bolted the door and shut the curtains before unpacking. The black case looked even more out of place here than it had in the woods, its sleek surface alien against the rough wood of his table. He powered on the laptop, the hum of the old fan filling the room. For a long moment he stared at the blank screen, considering what he was about to do. Then he connected the cable and waited. The computer recognized the drive instantly, but what appeared next made his chest tighten. The screen filled with a dense security interface military-grade encryption, layered with codes and warnings. Unauthorized access detected. Password required. Beneath the prompt was a series of fields labeled access key, authorization token, and biometric verification. Whoever had designed this system had not expected anyone outside their circle to see it. Dan leaned back, rubbing his temples. The idea that he could brute force his way into a government security drive was ridiculous. He knew better. Still, he tried a few guesses, half out of defiance, half curiosity. Nothing worked. After the fifth attempt, a red warning flashed briefly before disappearing. He shut the laptop down, suddenly aware of how loud his heartbeat was in the small room. The device wasn't meant for him to open. Yet he couldn't shake the sense that whatever it contained was something no one was supposed to find. The rest of the day passed in an anxious blur. He cleaned his rifle, paced the small confines of the cabin, and tried to read. But his mind kept circling back to the wreck and the photographs. When the sun began to set, he finally made himself a meal, though he ate little. Bear lay near the door, his gaze fixed on the window as if expecting movement. Dusk turned to full dark, and the forest outside disappeared into a sea of black. He had just started to drift into a shallow sleep when Bear's growl ripped through the silence. Dan sat up instantly, every muscle snapping to attention. The dog stood rigid, teeth bared, staring at the window. Dan moved quietly to the table, snatched his rifle, and killed the light. The cabin sank into darkness. Outside, somewhere beyond the clearing, came a sound, the faint crunch of gravel. A human step. Another followed, slow and deliberate. He crouched beside the door, holding his breath. The sound stopped. The night pressed against the walls like a living thing. Then from deep in the woods came the unmistakable hum of rotors. Not distant this time. Close. Low. The windows trembled slightly in their frames as the air throbbed with mechanical rhythm. Dan felt the vibration through the floorboards, faint but real. He crawled to the window and peeked through a gap in the curtain. The trees swayed in the downdraft of a helicopter hovering somewhere beyond the tree line. Its lights dimmed, a dark shadow against the stars. Bear barked once, sharp and defiant, before Dan could stop him. The sound shattered the stillness. The helicopter's lights flashed briefly, infrared, scanning. Dan ducked back, heart hammering. After a few seconds, the noise receded. The rotors grew fainter, then vanished entirely. The woods returned to silence, but the silence was different now, charged, expectant, waiting. He sat in the dark, gripping the rifle, while Bear paced restlessly. Whoever was looking for the wreck or for the box had not given up. Maybe they'd been watching since the day before. Maybe they had followed him all the way from the ravine. He looked at the sealed black case on the table, its polished surface catching the faint glow from the embers in the stove. He realized with a sick certainty that by bringing it home, he had already crossed a line he couldn't step back from. Outside, something moved again, a faint whisper of branches. Bear stopped pacing and growled deep in his throat. Dan raised the rifle, eyes locked on the door. The sound came once more, closer this time. He thought of the footprints by the wreck, the light in the forest, the helicopter circling in the fog. A single drop of sweat ran down his temple. He steadied his breathing, finger resting on the trigger. The forest went silent once more. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing happened. But the thought that kept repeating in his mind was far worse than the silence itself. If they knew where to find the wreck, they could find him too. And now he realized they probably already had. The night was long and unbroken. Dan did not sleep. He sat in the darkness until the pale outline of dawn began to filter through the small gaps in the curtains. Bear lay near the door, his breathing slow but not at ease. Every so often he lifted his head and stared toward the window, ears twitching to sounds only he could hear. When the sun finally rose, its light felt cold and thin, as though even the day itself didn't want to touch what had happened. The air inside the cabin was heavy with smoke and unease. Dan poured coffee and drank it black, his hands trembling slightly despite his effort to stay composed. He hadn't seen anyone outside during the night, but that didn't mean no one was there. The noise of the helicopter, the crunch of footsteps, the faint movement of the trees, they could have been tricks of exhaustion, yet deep down he knew they weren't. Someone had been close. Maybe they were still watching. He packed quickly. Food, ammunition, the black case, and just enough supplies to last a few days. Before leaving, he crouched near the door and checked the ground through the small window. The frost on the earth was broken. Fresh tracks, boot prints, Two sets, one heavier than the other, leading across the clearing toward the tree line. He studied the pattern. These weren't the wide, soft prints of hikers. They were narrow, deep, the kind left by tactical boots. Whoever had come had been trained to move quietly, but not quietly enough for the frost to forget them. He felt a slow burn of anger rising beneath the fear. He wasn't used to being hunted. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, tightened his pack, and gave a low command to Bear. The dog rose instantly, alert, tail stiff. They stepped into the morning light, the forest swallowing them almost at once. The deeper they went, the more the world returned to its indifferent rhythm. Sunlight pierced through the canopy in shifting gold patterns, and the air was sharp with pine resin. Dan moved carefully, taking the long route west toward an area he knew well. Old mining territory, mostly abandoned, riddled with shafts and tunnels. If someone was tracking him, he'd find out there. He used to fight wildfires in these mountains. He knew their veins better than most maps. Hours passed with only the sounds of birds and wind. Then faintly a mechanical hum drifted through the trees. He stopped, listening. It was distant but real, an engine, maybe two. Trucks, crawling slow along the Forest Service road that ran miles below this ridge. He crouched, using his binoculars to scan the valley. Through the narrow gap in the trees, he saw flashes of metal. Two dark vehicles moving deliberately, almost in formation. They weren't marked. They weren't lost. He watched until they disappeared beneath the bend of the road, then exhaled quietly. Whoever they were coming from the direction of his cabin. He pressed on, setting a punishing pace. Bear followed without complaint. They moved through creeks and over granite ridges to mask their trail. The forest thickened, turning damp and shadowed as clouds gathered overhead. By late afternoon, they reached the slope where the remnants of an old mine stood hidden among overgrown aspens. The entrance was half collapsed, the timbers rotted and slick with moss, but the tunnel beyond still held. He had camped here once, years ago. It would serve again. Inside, the air was cool and stale. He lit a lantern, its weak flame trembling against the black walls. The place smelled of old stone, rust, and forgotten years. He sat down, unrolled his pack, and set the black case beside him. It was the only piece of the puzzle that mattered now. Everything else, his fear, his exhaustion, even his life, was secondary to understanding what this thing carried. As he rested, Bear began pacing at the tunnel's mouth, growling low. Dan rose, following the dog's gaze to the narrow opening. For a moment he saw nothing. Then faintly, a shape flickered past the light. A shadow moving across the rocks. He cut the lantern immediately, plunging them into near-total darkness. The sound of footsteps echoed softly outside. Careful, measured. He raised his rifle, the weight of it steady in his hands. The footsteps stopped. Silence settled, thick and absolute. Minutes stretched. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the presence was gone. Dan waited another 10 minutes before daring to breathe again. When he finally stepped outside, the forest was empty. But in the mud near the entrance lay a fresh footprint, larger than his own, water pooling inside the impression. He followed the tracks for 100 yards until they vanished into the undergrowth. Whoever was out there had moved with skill. That kind of precision didn't belong to scavengers or hikers. It belonged to men who knew how to disappear. The sky began to darken with oncoming rain. Dan returned to the mine, lit the lantern again, and sat beside the crate, staring at it. He remembered the black box from the helicopter, the last voice of the pilot that had echoed in his mind since he'd found the wreck. The recorder. Maybe it had survived. Maybe it was still out there, buried beneath the wreckage or washed into a nearby ravine. If he could find it, he might understand what brought the machine down. He couldn't leave the truth half buried. At dawn, he set out again, leaving most of his gear hidden in the mine. The rain had turned the world to mist and mud. Bear trotted ahead, nose low, guiding the way back to the crash site. The forest seemed different now, as though aware of what he carried. When they reached the ravine, the wreck was unchanged, silent and cold. Dan climbed down carefully, his boots sinking into the damp earth. He searched the ground near the tail section, brushing aside debris. Nothing. Then Bear barked once, sharp and short, near a pile of twisted metal. Dan hurried over and saw it, a small metal cylinder half buried in mud, its casing dented but intact. Stamped across the surface were the words Flight Data Recorder. His pulse quickened. He wiped the grime away and saw a serial number still visible beneath the dirt. He didn't know why it had been left behind when everything else had been stripped, but he knew its value. If the data survived, it could tell him what happened on that flight. He turned to go, but the forest answered him with a sound he'd been dreading, the crack of a rifle. The bullet struck the earth near his feet, flinging dirt into the air. He dove behind the wreck, heart hammering. Bear barked furiously, teeth bared. Another shot rang out, closer this time, chipping the metal of the helicopter's hull. Dan crawled along the fuselage, searching for an opening. The shots came in pairs now, deliberate, controlled. Whoever was shooting wasn't panicked, they were trained. He reached for his rifle and fired back once, aiming high toward the ridge. The echo thundered through the valley. Silence followed. He waited, listening. Nothing moved. For nearly an hour he stayed hidden, every nerve alert, until the rain began to fall harder, masking sound and smell. When he finally emerged, the forest was empty again. Whoever had been there had withdrawn, perhaps thinking he was dead or pinned. He slung the recorder over his shoulder and began the long climb back toward the mine, soaked to the bone, but alive. By the time he reached shelter, night had fallen. The lantern's glow cast trembling shadows across the tunnel walls. He placed the recorder beside the black case and sat, shaking from exhaustion. He didn't yet know what secrets these two objects held, but together they were a key, and keys always led to doors someone wanted closed. He leaned against the damp stone, his breathing slowing, the steady patter of rain echoing outside. Bear lay beside him, eyes half closed but alert. Dan stared at the recorder, imagining the pilot's final moments, the chaos, the fall, the silence that followed. Somewhere inside that small box was the truth of what they had died for. As he drifted toward uneasy sleep, the faintest sound reached his ears, a distant mechanical whine, almost lost in the rain. He couldn't tell if it came from the forest below or the sky above. But it was there, steady and growing louder, a hum that didn't belong to nature. And when the first red dot of a laser sight flickered briefly across the rocks near the mine's entrance, Dan realized the hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. The faint red shimmer disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the darkness beyond the mine's mouth. Dan froze where he sat, the blood draining from his face. He had seen that kind of light before years ago, in Afghanistan, when a sniper's sight swept across the dust before the bullet came. Bear rose from the ground, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his body tense and ready to spring. The soft patter of rain outside had turned into a steady downpour, masking smaller sounds but amplifying the larger ones. Somewhere above the cliffs, an engine purred briefly, then fell silent. Whoever was hunting them had found the trail again. Dan reached for his rifle, extinguished the lantern, and waited, forcing his breathing to slow. The mine was a black tunnel now, cold air moving faintly through its rotten beams. The darkness became a living thing, full of shallow echoes, the drip of water, the faint rasp of metal against stone, and the distant shuffle of movement. Someone was out there, and they were moving carefully, testing the ground before committing. Minutes passed like hours. Then a sharp scrape of rock echoed from outside, followed by another, heavier sound. Boots. 2, maybe 3 sets. They were closing in. Dan touched Bear's shoulder lightly, a silent command. The dog slipped deeper into the tunnel, vanishing into the black. Dan followed, keeping one hand on the wall for guidance. The mine stretched farther than he remembered, branching into narrow side passages that smelled of rust and decay. When the first beam of light pierced the darkness behind him, Dan stopped breathing. It swept across the walls, trembling slightly, as the intruders crept inside. Their flashlights were low, military-grade, moving in coordinated arcs. He could hear their voices now, soft, clipped murmurs. Professional, precise. He edged down a side tunnel, crouching low, his heart pounding so hard he was sure it would give him away. Bear waited ahead, eyes reflecting faint light like 2 shards of glass. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. One of the voices whispered something, A short phrase Dan couldn't make out, and a red beam flicked across the rocks again, marking the walls. A search pattern. They were sweeping the tunnels. Dan's options were narrowing fast. He looked down and saw the flight recorder still hanging from his shoulder, its dull metal glinting faintly. He had dragged it out of the crash for answers, but now it was the reason men with guns were stalking him through the dark. He unhooked it and set it carefully in a crevice along the tunnel wall, covering it with a piece of torn tarp from an old mining crate. Then he moved silently toward the deeper end of the passage. Bear stayed close, his breathing steady but his muscles coiled tight. The flashlight beams came closer, washing faintly across the tunnel walls. The air smelled faintly of oil and gunmetal. Dan could almost feel their proximity, the careful coordination of people trained to move and kill in tight spaces. A small stone shifted under his boot, the sound sharp in the silence. One of the flashlights jerked upward instantly. A voice barked a short command. Dan didn't hesitate. He turned and fired once, the rifle's muzzle flash, blinding in the confined space. The shot echoed like thunder. A cry of pain followed, cut short. Then chaos, shouting, running, the crash of boots against rock. He grabbed Bear's collar and ran deeper into the mine. Bullets tore through the darkness behind them, ricocheting off the walls with screaming metallic whines. He ducked into another tunnel, lungs burning, the smell of gunpowder thick around him. They couldn't stay underground much longer. The mine was a trap. He needed a way out. The map of the area flashed in his mind, an old ventilation shaft near the back, half collapsed but still climbable. He turned toward where he remembered it would be and stumbled into a wider cavern where rainwater pooled on the floor. The air was damp and cold, but the sound of rain above told him the surface wasn't far. He found the shaft near the far wall, a jagged opening reinforced with rusted iron bars. Some had bent or broken over time. He looked up and saw faint daylight, a pale gray circle 30 feet above. Bear barked softly, the sound tight and controlled, urging him to hurry. Dan shoved his rifle across his back and began to climb, his boots slipping on the wet metal. The rain from above made the surface slick, and the smell of rust filled his nose. Behind them, the flashlights reappeared, slicing through the dark like knives. A voice shouted, and gunfire erupted again, bullets slamming into the walls around the shaft. Dan climbed faster. A bullet sparked off the metal inches from his hand. Bear barked again, this time with fury, and leapt upward, scrabbling for purchase beside him. Dan grabbed the dog's harness, hauling him up as he reached the edge of the opening. He pulled himself over the lip and rolled into the wet grass outside, gasping for breath. The rain fell in silver sheets, washing the mud from his face. For a moment, he lay still, listening. The gunfire had stopped. The shouts below were distant, frustrated. They didn't know the shaft led all the way to the surface. He grabbed Bear's collar and moved quickly through the trees, crouched low. The forest here was denser, the undergrowth heavy with ferns and fallen branches. He ran until his legs trembled, finally stopping beneath the shelter of a rock ledge. The rain muffled all sound. He waited there for a long time, rifle ready, expecting the pursuit to continue. But none came. Either they thought he was dead or they were regrouping. He wasn't going to wait to find out which. When the rain slowed to a drizzle, he took stock of what he had. His pack was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos of the mine. But he still had the black case. He unwrapped it from his coat, careful not to let water touch its electronic locks. It was the only thing they hadn't seen him drop. He didn't know what the men wanted most, the recorder, the box, or both. But the look of coordination, the presence of weapons, the precision of the search told him one thing. This wasn't a local operation. Whoever they were, they worked for someone powerful enough to keep a downed helicopter and its secrets off any public record. By late afternoon, the clouds broke, and thin sunlight returned to the forest. Dan found a ridge overlooking the valley. From there, he could see the narrow strip of road winding far below. 2 black SUVs were parked near the tree line, their hoods still steaming from the rain. 3 men stood beside them, one with binoculars, scanning the slope. Dan recognized the stance, the way they moved, former military, possibly private contractors. He watched as one man raised a radio to his mouth, then pointed toward the direction of the mine. Another nodded and climbed back into a vehicle. The engines roared to life. The convoy turned, heading east along the road. He exhaled slowly, relief tempered by realization. They were regrouping, maybe circling around, trying to cut him off. The forest wasn't large enough to hide him forever. He needed a way to contact someone who could understand what he had found without handing it straight back to the people hunting him. The black case and the recorder were proof of something, but proof meant nothing if it died with him in the woods. He thought about the flight recorder again, hidden in the tunnel behind the tarp. He had left it behind, but part of him knew he couldn't abandon it completely. Inside it might be the pilot's final message, coordinates, or names, something that tied all of this together. It was the voice of the dead, and it deserved to be heard. That night he made camp in a small hollow, shielded by granite and thick spruce. The fire he built was small, the smoke barely visible. He dried his clothes, fed Bear, and sat with the black case across his knees. The rain had stopped, and the forest was unnervingly still again. He connected the case to the laptop, the same way he had before, and powered it on. The familiar interface appeared, but this time something new flashed across the screen, a prompt requesting a secondary key, followed by a small blinking symbol in the corner. A signal indicator. It was trying to connect to a network. Dan's pulse spiked. The laptop shouldn't have any connection out here. He was miles from any tower. He ripped the cable free, killing the power instantly. But the damage, he realized, was likely already done. The box had tried to transmit something, perhaps its location. He swore under his breath, staring at it, the truth dawning cold and hard. The device was more than storage. It was a beacon. The night stretched long and restless. Dan stayed awake, rifle in hand, the faint glow of embers casting shadows over the mossy ground. Somewhere in the distance, a low rumble of engines echoed again, carried on the wind. He looked down at Bear, whose eyes were open, reflecting the firelight. They both knew what it meant. They were no longer just witnesses to a secret. They were marked by it. And whatever the dead pilot had wanted to reveal to the world, someone alive was willing to kill to keep it buried. Dawn came gray and uneasy, the kind of light that couldn't decide whether to reveal or conceal. Dan sat motionless against a tree, his rifle across his lap, the dying embers of the fire whispering faint trails of smoke into the cold air. Bear slept beside him, though even in sleep the dog's ears twitched at every shift in the wind. Neither of them had truly rested. The night had been full of distant noises, engines somewhere beyond the ridges, the faint chop of a helicopter miles off, the restless pulse of danger that seemed to breathe through the forest now like an unseen predator. Dan studied the black case lying on the ground in front of him. Even now it seemed to hum with silent energy, an object that didn't belong in the world of moss, dirt, and pine needles. He remembered the flicker on the laptop screen, the signal symbol blinking like a pulse before he'd ripped the cable free. It had tried to reach something or someone. And if it had succeeded, it meant they already knew exactly where he was. He rubbed a hand across his face, exhaustion tugging at his thoughts. The only thing he knew for certain was that he couldn't stay here another hour. He needed to move, but not blindly. If the men chasing him were as coordinated as they seemed, the road was compromised, the valleys watched, and the air likely monitored. The only chance left was the old ranger station to the south, a relic from the 60s, hidden near a burned-out section of forest. It had a shortwave radio, or at least it used to. If he could power it up, he might reach someone outside the chain of whatever shadow organization wanted him dead. It wasn't a plan built on hope, it was built on desperation, but that was all he had left. He packed fast, keeping the essentials. His rifle, a small ration of food, the case wrapped in oiled cloth, and a canteen. Before leaving, he scouted the surrounding area carefully. In the mud near the base of the ridge, he found what he had feared. Fresh tire tracks, narrow and deep, belonging to off-road tactical vehicles. They hadn't come up to his camp, but they were close, maybe half a mile away, following a pattern, a slow, tightening circle. He knelt beside the tracks, feeling the cold imprint of the treads with his fingertips. Whoever they were methodical, patient. They weren't chasing him blindly. They were hurting him. He and Bear moved south along the ridge, keeping to high ground where the trees grew close enough to break line of sight from above. The morning stayed still, every sound magnified, the groan of branches, the snap of frost underfoot, the faint rasp of his own breathing. Bear led the way, nose low, muscles taut. For hours they moved without a word. The forest seemed endless, but Dan knew every slope, every hollow. He had grown up hunting here as a boy with his father, back when the world had been simpler and the woods were just woods, not a battlefield of ghosts and secrets. By midday the sky darkened again, heavy with clouds. He reached the burned valley just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The charred trees stood like skeletons, black and brittle, their trunks split open from the heat of long-ago fires. In the middle of the desolation stood the ranger station, a squat wooden building half sunk into the slope. One of the walls had collapsed, and the roof sagged under years of rot, but the tower above it still stood. If luck had a sense of mercy left, the old radio might still work. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of mold and rust. Dust clung to every surface, and animal tracks crisscrossed the floor. Dan set his rifle down and searched the room methodically. Most of the equipment was useless. The wires gnawed through, batteries corroded. But in the corner, half buried under debris, he found the console and old Collins transceiver, built like a tank. He brushed away the dust, tracing his fingers over the faded dials. The main power source was dead, but there was a backup, a hand-crank generator bolted to the floor. It might be enough to send a short-burst transmission. He set the black case on the table beside it and stared at it for a long moment. The idea formed slowly but firmly. He didn't need to open it anymore. He didn't even need to understand what was inside. He only needed to make sure someone else did, someone who could expose it before the people behind it erased both the evidence and him from the face of the earth. He thought of the flight recorder buried in the mine, the voices it might still hold, the desperate pilot who had died trying to protect it. Whatever was inside this device was part of the same web, a network of corruption that had turned men into ghosts and machines into graves. He turned the crank, slow at first, then faster, feeling the resistance build. The lights on the transceiver flickered weakly. Static hissed through the speaker, a dry, endless whisper. He adjusted the dial, searching for a frequency, any frequency that wasn't dead air. Then, through the static, a faint voice broke through a signal from somewhere far away, distorted but real. He leaned closer, heart pounding. "Station copy identify." The words were faint, almost lost in the static. Dan pressed the transmit button. "This is..." He hesitated, realizing how dangerous the truth could be. "This is a private party in Montana backcountry. Emergency broadcast. Possible military incident. Need contact with civilian federal channel." The reply came after several long seconds. "Copy that transmission weak, please. Repeat coordinates." Dan looked around helplessly. He didn't dare broadcast his exact position. He couldn't know who was listening. Before he could decide what to say, Bear growled low, his body suddenly rigid. Dan turned toward the doorway, just as a flash of red light streaked across the wall inside the cabin. Laser sights. They had found him again. He dived to the ground, pulling Bear with him as gunfire shattered the silence. The windows blew apart in a shower of glass. Bullets ripped through the walls, splintering wood. He grabbed his rifle and fired back through the opening, hitting nothing but air. The attackers were moving fast, spreading around the cabin. He heard the hum of engines outside the vehicles from the ridge. He kicked over the table, using it as cover, and reloaded. The radio hissed, still alive, still transmitting. "Repeat unknown contact, please confirm situation," the voice said again. Dan didn't answer. He looked at the black case lying in the open, rain starting to drip through the shattered roof and patter against its surface. He knew he couldn't let them take it. "Bear!" "Owner," he shouted, pointing toward the back of the cabin where the hill rose steeply. The dog darted toward the rear wall. Dan grabbed the case, slung it across his shoulder, and ran after him, ducking under a hail of bullets. He hit the back door with his shoulder, splintering the wood, and burst out into the rain. The slope behind the station was a muddy incline, slick and uneven, but he climbed it with desperate strength, Bear scrambling beside him. The gunfire grew fainter below, then stopped altogether. He turned once, just long enough to see the flash of flames erupting from the cabin. They were burning it. He kept moving until he reached the crest of the ridge. The valley below glowed faintly with firelight, the wreckage of the station already beginning to smoke. Rain fell harder, smothering the flames in patches. But the damage was done. His only means of contact with the outside world was gone. He was alone again, with nothing but the forest and the secrets that had ruined his life. That night they found shelter under a rocky overhang. Dan built no fire. He couldn't risk the light. He sat with the case in his lap, running his fingers over the embossed letters DOE Contractor Division, and thought of everything that had happened since he first found the wreck in the ravine. Every step had drawn him deeper into something vast and invisible. A war fought not with armies, but with silence and fear. Somewhere, people were making decisions that killed men like the pilot, erased evidence and left machines to rot under moss and pine, and now those same people wanted to erase him. He leaned back against the cold rock, exhaustion pulling at him. Bear rested his head on Dan's knee, eyes reflecting the faint gleam of moonlight. For the first time, Dan let the thought form fully in his mind. Maybe there was no one left to call for help. Maybe the only thing left to do was vanish entirely, bury the evidence somewhere no one could ever find it. Let the secret die with the forest. But then he thought of the pilot's body still strapped in the wreckage, the man who had risked everything to keep this information from falling into the wrong hands. That man hadn't hidden it to let it rot. He had hidden it for someone to find, for someone to finish what he had started. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it a low rhythmic thump. Helicopter rotors again, but closer this time. The sound grew louder, circling the valley. Dan crouched low, gripping Bear's collar. The searchlight flicked briefly across the ridges below, white and blinding, even from this distance. It moved methodically, sweeping the forest, then lingered on the smoldering ruin of the ranger station. He watched it hover there for a long moment before drifting away. When silence returned, Dan realized the truth that chilled him deeper than the cold ever could. They weren't searching randomly. They had been following a signal. The black case had betrayed him again. Despite being wrapped, despite every precaution, it was still transmitting, still calling to its makers. He looked down at it, heart pounding, the weight of its importance crushing him. He could destroy it, smash it open, bury it, throw it into the river. But if the data inside was the only record of whatever crime had killed that pilot, it might be the only thing that could bring justice, the only proof that mattered. His mind warred between the instinct to survive and the duty that wouldn't let him walk away. The first light of dawn touched the horizon before he finally made his choice. He stood, the case gripped tight in his hand, and whispered a command to Bear. The dog rose silently beside him. Together they started down the far side of the ridge, toward the one place left that might hold the truth, the wrecked helicopter in the ravine. If there was a key, a clue, or a way to unlock the data inside the case, it would be there, buried in the machine that had started everything. As the two figures disappeared into the misty forest below, the first distant echo of engines rolled again across the mountains, closer and more deliberate this time. The hunt hadn't stopped. It had merely changed direction. And though Dan didn't yet know it, what waited for him at the wreck was not just the answer he sought, but the final test of whether he would live long enough to reveal it. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't stop here. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, share this video to spread the mystery, and watch the next story that's already waiting for you. It's even more unbelievable than this one.